Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new collection of trusted resources to help clarify and strengthen your participation in global missions. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Welcome to this first episode of Season 4 of the Global Missions Podcast. Whether you've been with us since the beginning in 2015 or this is your first episode, we're glad that you've chosen to join us as learners. On behalf of our entire team, welcome. We hope this podcast will be a blessing to you. We'd like to extend special thanks to those who participated in our listener survey over the summer. We've read all your responses and been incorporating those ideas into our planning. The survey confirmed that our audience includes a wide range of people, actually, especially those serving on missions committees and those of you considering or preparing for mission service. There were also a number of pastors who filled out the survey, which we really appreciate, as we want to clearly support the vision and leadership that pastors provide for global missions. One major theme we observed was the clear desire to strengthen missions in the local church, how to inform and inspire the congregation. And we were a little surprised that short-term missions did not emerge as a high priority topic for the coming season. So we're listening and planning around all of this. Of course, if you still have input that you'd like to share with us, we'd be glad to hear from you at any time through our website or social media, Facebook or Twitter. Okay, I am really excited to kick off this new season with today's conversation. We have a deeply experienced mission leader who has a big heart for local churches. We're going to muse together on this vital cooperation between local churches and mission agencies. We've entitled this episode, How to Choose a Mission Agency. Our guest today is Paul Seger, who has served as the General Director of Biblical Ministries Worldwide since 1994. Now, Paul, here in Canada, BMW also means a type of car. Do you ever get that confused?
We certainly do.
It's a nice confusion in that case. These are really nice vehicles, too. Paul grew up in Nigeria. He's an MK, where his parents served as missionaries for many years and now lives with his wife in the Atlanta area. The Segers began their missionary service with Biblical Ministries Worldwide back in 1975. Thank you for being an example of faithful service, Paul. Appreciate that. Paul is an author. I want to mention his book. It's entitled Senders, How Your Church Can Identify, Train, and Deploy Missionaries. And Paul is no stranger even to the Global Missions Podcast. He has done an episode with us before. And so, Paul, I want to say welcome back to the Global Missions Podcast.
Well, thank you, Mags. It's sure good to be back. Thank you for what you're doing in spreading word about missions.
Well, glad to serve together. Paul is going to share with us today about one particular chapter. We're going to dive deep into chapter 7 about mission agencies. Just before we get to that, Paul, would you just tell us again a little bit about your role right now with Biblical Ministries Worldwide?
Well, I serve as the CEO, so that entails keeping us in line with our mission, our purpose statement, casting vision for the organization, leading the organization, providing great services to the mission family, and of course helping to mobilize the next generation mission field.
Mm-hmm. And what led you to actually put these ideas down into a book and to write the book Senders?
Well, I guess the driving factor was just the centrality of the local church in Scripture, that the local church really needs to be the catalyst and the motivator and the producer of missions. But there was two other things that sort of rang my bell. One is I saw this statistic from a denomination that is really known for missions, and they said only 12% of their churches had ever sent a missionary to the field. Now, they all support missionaries, and every church I go to loves missionaries, supports missionaries, but probably maybe only 10 or 20% of them have ever sent a missionary from their church. And so I wanted to do something to encourage churches to maybe ramp that up. And then the second thing was simply the decline of Bible colleges and seminaries. Many close their doors. They tend to be struggling to keep their doors open. And so there's not as many people going into Bible colleges and seminaries, but I'm convinced there are pews full of people that with some training and equipping and providing the channel, they could get to the mission field. So I'm very optimistic about the potential that we still have. And it's right there in the local church.
Mm-hmm. Great perspective, and just gladly agree with what you've said about the primacy of the church, but the ways that we can serve around it. This leads just perfectly into our conversation today, which is about how churches, especially, and mission workers to some degree, can choose a mission agency or agencies to partner with. Let's begin with just a foundational question. Why do we need these mission agencies? Should we even have mission agencies in these days?
It's real clear from Scripture that the local church is the way God designed things to happen, at least during this era of history. But there are complexities and differences today from what, for instance, the Apostle Paul had to deal with. So agencies basically just bring to a local church some services that a local church may want to outsource. They could do this themselves, but they may want to use organizations like ours. It's just a way to help the local church to maybe do better in what they're doing with the Great Commission.
Do you see examples in Scripture that support a mission agency, even if it's not explicit?
Yeah, I'm oftentimes asked that question, what is the biblical rationale for a mission agency? I think there are passages of scriptures, for instance, like Acts chapter 20, verse 4, which is a list of 5, 6, or 7 men. And we would oftentimes just skip over a verse like that. But for those of us in missions, it speaks volumes. Basically, this was just a group of men that accompanied the Apostle Paul. They all came from different local churches, but they had teamed up to accomplish something. And I think that is really the core or the kernel of what a mission agency is. And obviously, they didn't have the 501c3 status back in those days. But a mission agency, that's really all it is. It's a way that a group of people from different local churches want to link arms to accomplish something in the Great Commission. So I think there is the biblical rationale, plus all of what the Bible talks about, teamwork and how we need to work together rather than separately. So that's, I think, the biblical rationale or the understanding of what an agency is.
Well, really agree with what you've said, and Paul's book really supports this too, gives a primacy to the church and really indicates that agencies like BMW and like Send, I serve with Send International, we exist to serve the church and not the other way around. And that's really clear and reinforced through Paul's book. Paul, you mentioned in your book that there are 2 types of mission agencies. These are macro categories, of course. Clearinghouse agencies and full service agencies. Let's just take a minute and unpack what you mean by those terms, clearinghouse and full service.
In round figures, there are basically 2 kinds of agencies. Some missionaries want less services and support systems than others, and so there's validity for both kinds. But the clearinghouse kind of organization basically just handles the finances. So it's a place where donors can get a tax-deductible receipt, send their funds. That organization then will get the funds to the missionary. And that's really what they do. That's where their area of expertise is. And that's really the only support system that missionary or that church wants for their missionary. Then there are other agencies that are full service. They provide a whole menu of services to provide support systems for a missionary. I was recently in a restaurant in Africa, and they had this pretty elaborate menu. But when it came to ordering, they basically sheepishly said that, we've got one thing. And so... it's the difference between going to a one-item restaurant or a buffet. And so really that's just depending on what a missionary wants. Some want the buffet, some want one service. And so there are some agencies that do one, some that do the other, and it's up to the local church and that individual to decide which one would serve them best.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hear you saying that both have their place. It's not necessarily one is better than the other. It really depends on the discernment of the church then. Well, we want to talk particularly today, use the remaining time we have to talk about a bit of a roadmap that a church could use. And I think this would apply to a mission worker as well, but particularly to a missions committee, a pastor, or a group of believers who are thinking of working with an agency and asking some key questions. And the way Paul has laid this out in his chapter in his book is he's provided 5 key forks in the road, he describes them as. And Paul, we want to spend our time unpacking these 5 key forks in the road. They're key considerations that a church should ask when they're considering working with an agency. What's the first fork in the road?
Well, because we see doctrine and theology and what we believe is so important. It's really doctrine, in my opinion, because that will either sync with you or not. And so to make sure that you're in the organization that reflects your theological position is so critical. You know, an agency will either bless you or frustrate you. It'll either be a blessing or it'll be a burr in your saddle. And so you really want to choose the right agency first. In fact, I would argue choosing the right agency is more important than choosing the country you go to, because both will potentially have their frustrations, but you want the agency that you're in sync with doctrinally, because you don't want to get to the field and then have theological arguments with coworkers. You want to be able to be in sync with them.
In your experience, as you've explored this with sending churches, how does it practically take place? Is it a missions committee that you engage with on this? Are pastors involved? How does it unfold?
Well, I guess with all of us as agencies, we simply put our doctrinal position out there. And agencies vary in the amount of detail that they'll put in their doctrinal positions. Some have a expanded version, others are more basic. And so a church or a missionary really needs to find their comfort level with how much detail they need. And so we sort of just put it out there and say, look, here's who we are. We recognize there are people that differ from us and maybe want to do it differently. That's fine, but here's who we are. And so I guess we just are transparent and say, look, there's our position. Here's what we believe. Here's what we teach. And if you find yourself in sync with that, then you'd perhaps be happy working with us.
That's good. So the first fork in the road is ensuring that you have a common view of biblical doctrine. What is the second fork in the road?
Well, if you've passed that one, once you've taken the fork in the road and said, okay, there's the one that doctrinally I'm fit with, I think the next thing to really look for is the values of that organization. And when we talk about the value of an organization, you're talking about their culture, their personality, what's important to that organization. And each organization has different things that are important to them. And so you want to find an organization that values the same things that you do. Otherwise, again, we could be a frustration to you if one thing is important to us but not important to you.
I recently heard it described that the doctrine the first fork in the road describes what we believe. The values will describe how we will behave. And, that doctrine will be enacted in the personality of the organization, like you said. Are there some examples you could give us as far as values go, the key values we should consider?
Well, some of our values relate to things like the importance of the local church. We are all about the local church. We're going to establish local churches. We're going to serve local churches. So if a person doesn't value the local church, they might find us a little frustrating. Another value to us is relationships. We're more of a mission family than a corporation. For us, both our ministry as well as the way we relate to each other is based on relationships rather than a business or a corporation. Prayer is a big value to us, and if that's not to you, then we could be a source of frustration to you. Lifelong learning is important, and so if you're not committed to lifelong learning, we keep pressing on that and build it into our job descriptions, and part of our budgeting and part of our time is related to that. So if that's not important to a person, they may find us a little bit frustrating. So it's those kinds of things that are just things that we keep pressing on and make a big deal about. And so those are just things that sort of make up our culture. That's what's important to us.
Well, very good. There's the first two forks in the road, doctrinal compatibility and then core values of a mission agency, things that a church thinking about doing missions should explore with an agency that might cooperate with. In just a moment, I'll ask Paul to share the final three considerations, the final three forks in the road. Just before we get to that, we'd like to share a resource with you that might be helpful for you and your church.
Your profession, your skills, your passions. It's you making disciples of the nations. Crossworld desires to help you engage the world's least reached marketplaces in the ways God has gifted you. To learn more about Crossworld and our global opportunities, we invite you to visit crossworld.org today. And now, back to today's conversation.
Well, we're back with Paul Seger from Biblical Ministries Worldwide, who is helping us unpack 5 critical forks in the road for churches that are evaluating mission agencies to partner with. Paul, we've talked about the first two, doctrine and core values. What is the third fork in the road?
The third is really policies. What policies, to put it negatively, what rules does this organization have? Every organization has policies they run by. So you got to find policies that are not going to grate you, that you understand and appreciate.
Are there particular elements that seem to come up regularly in this that you would encourage a missions committee to ask about?
Well, a lot of the policies revolve around things like finances. How are those handled? What are the policies related to things like, can you purchase a home when you're on the field? What kind of reporting is done? What kind of organizational structure is there? What kind of support schedule is there? Are there policies related to schooling your children, or furloughs, or prayer letters, or personal standards? What kind of medical insurance they have? There's all these kinds of things that are just the nuts and bolts of how you run an organization, any organization. Mm-hmm. And all of us have them, but you want to find ones that you're going to be able to abide by and be in agreement with. And so those are just practical nuts and bolts policies that relate to how you function within that organization.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned in the book that really those policies are built on a lot of experience, maybe from a particular context. They're really designed to guide and to protect. What I'm hearing you say, though, is they should still be considered ahead of time and not assumed. We're moving from assumptions to intentional awareness.
Exactly, because you don't want to join an organization, end up on the field, and find out there are just a whole bunch of policies that you're going to really struggle to abide by. Again, we want to be a blessing to people. We don't want to be a pain in the neck.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Important policies should be considered. What is the fourth fork in the road?
I think the fourth thing that you really want to look at carefully, if you want to go with a full service organization, is what services are actually available. What kind of support system could I expect to get from this organization?
And, when we talk about services, earlier we talked about the clearinghouse, an agency that might have a particular specialty, or a full service agency. What are some of the things that should be considered in the services?
Well, for instance, I would want to see whether or not they're going to provide training for me, either initial or ongoing. Mm-hmm. What kind of accountability system is in place? What kind of financial services are there? For instance, our organization has an individual that fills out income tax returns for missionaries. For my whole missionary career, for 40 some years now, I've never filled out an income tax return. Wouldn't know how and don't want to. But I'm so grateful for an organization that helps me to do that. I don't have to worry about April 15 when we file taxes here in the States. It just comes and goes. What they will do by way of helping me in my communication, if we still do prayer letters, whether they have field conferences, whether they have emergency management services, what kind of support system they have for printed materials, lifelong learning opportunities. It's just a long list of things that an agency does to support a missionary, whether they can care for me both spiritually and in my ministry, whether they'll help me with recruiting, all of those kinds of things. Our services that we provide is sort of that buffet that I mentioned before, the menu of services that you could go along this buffet and pick out those pieces that you want.
It's going to really depend on the capacity of a church community as well. They may be able to provide some services, but which ones are better provided by an agency, or if a church community is not able to provide those services themselves, finding it in the agency, it's really going to depend on the sending community.
Yeah, really, any church could do everything that a mission agency does. They would need to probably hire another staff member or two to provide all of these services. And so many churches say, you know what, we find it more cost effective and efficient just to outsource that to an organization like Send or our organization, because we have a certain level of expertise that we can provide for them. So that's really up to a local church whether they want to invest that much or whether they just as soon outsource that to an organization like ours.
Right. This is where, in our experience, there is sometimes a tension point as well, because, of course, to provide these services, any agency or church will have to invest to, gather that expertise together. And that's where sometimes the costs come in. We have felt, some tension with sending communities, with churches, as they engage, well, how much do these services cost? Have you had experience with that too?
Oh, yes. That's common discussion. But once you start digging into the details of it and say, well, if you did all of these things yourself, Normally the cost is so prohibitive that a local church says, wow, we're getting quite a deal by outsourcing this to a mission organization.
Really appreciate that perspective. Now, fair to say that we're speaking from the agency's point of view, but we just encourage a real candid discussion on these important services and making sure, if I could add this, not to put a ministry at risk because we're trying to cut corners on the services. That is a concern that we've also raised, that in just trying to do it in a budget fashion, if I could call it that we not overlook some of the important services that will help a missionary family really thrive. That's 4 forks in the road. We've got one left. We've got doctrinal compatibility. We've got core values. We've got policies and services. What is the 5th and final fork in the road, Paul?
I think the 5th one is the candidate orientation, which is, in our instance, like a 2-week job interview. It's 2 weeks of the individual getting to know our organization getting to know them, and then helping them get ready for deputation. So it's almost like a job interview. That really helps you to dig down deep and to really, well, I've sort of used the illustration of the courtship before marriage. Before you say I do, you want to spend some time courting. You don't want to decide the first day, so you really want to get to know each other. That engagement period, I think, is important before you make a final decision.
Mm-hmm. Now, often we see individuals or families, households engaging with agencies. I wonder what practical steps you would encourage a church to take as they're exploring that partnership during the candidate orientation.
We work hard at trying to build the relationship with the church. In fact, during that candidate orientation, we invite pastors, the individual's pastor, to come and spend part of that time with us. So they're not making a decision in isolation, that they get to know the organization as well. We're out on the road a lot with pastors, just trying to help them understand who we are so that there's a healthy relationship, because we're here to serve them.
Mm-hmm.
And the more the local church and the missions committee understands the organization, I think the happier the relationship will be.
That's very good. Paul, we have just quickly kind of opened these topics. It's been in a summary format here. If our listeners wanted to learn more and think more carefully about how to choose a mission agency, what resources would you recommend to them?
Well, there's a number that I might suggest. A couple of books. One is Well Sent by Steve Byrne. Mm-hmm. He's the missions pastor of a large church in Pennsylvania. Well Sent deals with what a local church can do in that process. Another key book that I would recommend is Pat Hood's book, The Sending Church. The subtitle is The Church Must Leave the Building. I think both of those are very profitable books in helping to think this through.
Super. We'll include those, as our regular listeners know, in the show notes if you'd like to check out those books. And also, I'll just mention we have done an interview with Steve as well on the Global Missions Podcast, and we'll include a link to that interview with Steve also. Paul, just as we wind down here, I wonder if you could imagine your opportunity to speak to missions committees across North America. This group is wanting to do a great job of missions from their church. They need to explore working with agencies, and we've provided them with a bit of a pathway here that they could follow. But if you could just address them, what would you encourage them with as they get going in this process?
I would encourage them to be deliberate in this. I think sometimes churches may be somewhat reactive. A missionary shows up on their door and they have not been so deliberate in thinking through, is this an organization that's compatible with us, that is going to fulfill what we have as a vision as our church? So I guess deliberateness and doing research would be the main thing.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, Paul is serving with Biblical Ministries worldwide. Paul, just give us the website for that organization if folks wanted to find it.
It's biblicalministries.org.
biblicalministries.org. And if any of our listeners would like to follow up with you, if they've got questions to unpack, how could they reach out to you?
I'd be happy to dialogue through email. My email address is pseger, that's P-S-E-G-E-R, at biblicalministries.org.
There you go, friends. Our conversation together with Paul winds down here. And Paul, just want to say a big thank you again for joining us and sharing some from your book. I want to warmly recommend Paul's book again, Senders, How Your Church Can Identify, Train, and Deploy Missionaries. We just entrust you to the Lord for his blessing, Paul, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for what you're doing through these podcasts.
Well, that concludes our conversation with Paul. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can find the show notes at globalmissionspodcast.com, including links to all of the resources mentioned in today's episode. That's all for now. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening. Join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.